Blood under Roman's fingernails smelled like copper and cheap cigars, a stark contrast to the panicked voice bleeding through his phone speaker. "Please come home now," Maria, his oldest maid, whispered. "She'll destroy her." Not a threat of bullets or fire, a promise of something worse. Roman shoved the heavy oak doors open 20 minutes later, bracing for shattered glass or screaming. Instead, he found deafening silence, a puddle of lukewarm tea, and a sight that made his chest cave in. The damp basement of the shipping warehouse smelled of ozone, wet concrete, and the sickeningly sweet cologne of a man who thought he could skim from the Rossi syndicate and live to spend it. Roman stood in the center of the room, rolling his shoulders to work out a knot of tension that had taken residence at the base of his neck since breakfast. He didn't look like a kingpin. There were no tailored suits down here. He wore a simple, dark grey Henley, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and smeared with someone else's mistakes. He dragged a coarse, industrial paper towel across his knuckles. The rough texture rasped against his skin, catching on a split seam near his pinky. It was just Tuesday. The banality of the violence was what exhausted him most. In the corner, Leo, his lieutenant, was quietly folding a set of heavy pliers. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow dripping of a leaky pipe in the far corner, a metronome keeping time with the shallow, ragged breaths of the man slumped in the steel chair. Roman reached into his pocket as his phone vibrated. The sharp buzzing against his ribs was an intrusion. Few people had this number. Even fewer used it when he was working. He pulled it out, staring at the cracked screen. Maria, his housekeeper. She was a woman who navigated the sprawling, cold expanse of his estate like a ghost, blind to the illegalities, deaf to the late-night meetings, focused only on keeping the marble floors polished and the pantry stocked. She texted when the butcher was late. She texted when the boiler acted up. She never, ever called. Roman swiped his thumb over the glass, pressing the speaker to his ear. Speak. He expected a complaint about the security detail tracking mud onto the Persian rugs. Instead, what he heard was the wet, ragged sound of a woman attempting to swallow her own terror. "Mr. Rossi." Maria's voice was a frail, trembling wire. "You need to come back. Please." Roman froze. He didn't drop the bloody paper towel, but his grip tightened, squeezing a drop of red onto the toe of his leather boot. "Is it the police? Did someone breach the gate?" "No." A sharp intake of breath, a muffled sound, as if she were hiding in a closet, pressing her hand over her mouth. "It's your wife. It's Beatrice. She came back early from Milan." A cold stone dropped into Roman's stomach. Beatrice. His legally bound business transaction. A woman carved from ice and old money, with eyes like chipped flint and a heart that pumped liquid nitrogen. They lived in the same massive house, but existed in entirely different hemispheres. She never came home early. "Lock the doors to the east wing," Roman instructed, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the dead, flat tone he used to order executions. "Keep Beatrice out of there." "She's not in the east wing, Mr. Rossi." Maria began to quietly, pathetically sob. "She's in the library, with Miss Nora. Please come home now. She'll destroy her." Roman's chest seized. The air in the basement suddenly felt thick, unbreathable. Nora wasn't a wife. She wasn't a transaction. She was the collateral he had taken in 6 months ago to settle a dead man's debt. A quiet, stubborn woman who restored antique books and smelled of linseed oil, vanilla, and dust. She was the one soft, untainted thing in his rotting world. He had hidden her in the estate, convinced himself he was protecting her from the wolves outside, conveniently ignoring that he was the biggest wolf of all. "I'm 10 minutes away," Roman said, hanging up. He didn't look at Leo. He didn't look at the man in the chair. He simply dropped the paper towel onto the damp concrete, turned, and walked up the stairs. Outside, a heavy, freezing rain had begun to fall. It battered the hood of his black Jaguar, washing the grime from the dark paint. Roman threw himself into the driver's seat, the leather groaning under his weight. The engine roared to life with a guttural snarl, and he tore out of the gravel lot, the tires spinning and spitting wet stones into the dark. The drive was a blur of smeared streetlights and rhythmic, thumping windshield wipers. Roman's mind raced, a chaotic tangle of contradictions. He was a man who ordered men to be buried in foundations without blinking, yet his hands, still stained with rust-colored blood, were shaking against the steering wheel. She'll destroy her. Maria's words echoed in his skull. What did that mean? Beatrice wasn't physical. She didn't carry weapons. She found blood vulgar. Beatrice's violence was surgical, psychological. She dismantled people. She found the loose thread in a person's psyche and pulled it until there was nothing left but a pile of yarn on the floor. He pushed the accelerator closer to the floorboard, the Jaguar surging forward on the slick asphalt. He thought of Nora, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she read, the way she refused to look at his guards, the way she had slowly, incrementally, allowed him to sit in the same room with her during the quiet evenings. He had built a delicate glass house of an illusion, that he was a misunderstood protector, that she could learn to see past his sins. Beatrice carried a hammer, and she was standing in his glass house. The heavy iron gates of the estate parted just fast enough for Roman to slip the Jaguar through without tearing the metal off its hinges. He didn't bother parking in the garage. He slammed the brakes, letting the car skid to a halt on the wet gravel circle before the main entrance. He left the engine running, the driver's side door hanging wide open to the driving rain. He took the front steps 2 at a time, his boots heavy and wet. He shoved the massive double oak doors inward. They hit the stops with a dull, booming thud that echoed through the cavernous foyer. He expected chaos. He expected the sound of breaking porcelain, or Maria screaming, or Nora crying. He found silence. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and the lingering sharp scent of ozone from the storm outside. The massive chandelier cast a cold, fractured light across the black and white marble floor. "Maria!" Roman barked. The sound of his own voice felt violently loud, deeply out of place. From the shadow of the main staircase, a small figure emerged. Maria. She was clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles were white, her dark uniform rumpled. She looked at Roman, her eyes wide, terrified, and darting toward the heavy mahogany doors of the library down the west hall. She didn't speak. She just pointed. Roman drew a breath. It tasted like ash. He walked down the corridor, his wet boots squeaking softly, agonizingly, against the polished wood. Every step felt heavier than the last. He didn't reach for the gun, holstered at the small of his back. A gun was useless here. He reached the library doors. One was slightly ajar. Roman pushed it open with the flat of his palm. The library was a sprawling room of dark oak, floor-to-ceiling shelves, and heavy velvet drapes that had been pulled shut against the storm. A fire cracked lazily in the massive stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the Persian rug. The air was thick with the smell of bergamot tea, old paper, and the distinct, acrid smoke of a Gauloise's cigarette. In the center of the room, seated at the low, antique mahogany table, was Beatrice. She wore a tailored emerald green silk blouse, not a wrinkle on it. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, perfect chignon. Her posture was impeccable, spine straight, one leg crossed over the other. In one hand, she held a delicate bone china teacup. In the other, a thin cigarette. the ash growing dangerously long. Across from her sat Nora. Nora was wearing an oversized cable-knit grey sweater Roman had given her when the winter draft started. She was slumped forward, her shoulders pulled up toward her ears, perfectly still. "Ah," Beatrice said. She didn't turn her head. She merely took a slow sip of her tea, the clink of the cup against the saucer ringing out like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The master of the house returns. You're tracking mud onto the rug, Roman." Roman stepped fully into the room, his eyes locked on Nora. "Nora," he breathed. Nora didn't move. She didn't turn around. She was staring down at the table. Roman's eyes tracked to the mahogany surface. It wasn't empty. Spread out between the two women was an autopsy of Roman's life. It wasn't weapons or drugs, it was paper. Neat, organized stacks of paper. Bank ledgers, title deeds, blackmail photographs, and sitting directly in front of Nora, illuminated by the warm, mocking glow of the fire, was a thick manila folder. Roman's stomach plummeted. It was the file from his private safe. The safe, hidden behind the wall panel in his study. The safe only he and Beatrice knew the combination to. "I was just telling our guest a story," Beatrice murmured, taking a slow drag from her cigarette. She exhaled a plume of blue smoke that drifted lazily toward the ceiling. A fascinating little fairy tale about a knight in shining armor who rescues a poor, indebted girl. It's a lovely narrative, Roman. Truly. It belongs in one of her little restored books. Roman felt the blood drain from his face. "Beatrice, stop." His voice was a raspy command that held absolutely no power. "But I felt the story lacked context," Beatrice continued, her tone smooth, conversational, utterly devoid of malice. That was the terror of her. She wasn't angry. She was bored and precise. Context is so important, don't you think? For instance, the context of her brother's tragic gambling debt. "Shut your mouth," Roman said, taking a step forward, his hands balling into fists. Beatrice smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of her lips. She tapped her cigarette against a crystal ashtray. "I was just explaining to Nora that her brother, Thomas, didn't actually owe the rival syndicate money. He owed you money, Roman. And he didn't die in a convenient, tragic hit-and-run on the coastal highway." Beatrice leaned forward, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper that made Roman sick to his stomach. "He was suffocated in the back of a panel van by a man named Leo, under direct orders from the man currently ruining my Persian rug." Roman stopped breathing. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. Nora finally moved. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. Slowly, mechanically, she raised her head and turned to look at Roman. Roman braced himself for tears. He braced himself for her to scream, to throw the hot tea in his face, to rush at him with her fists. He could handle anger. Anger meant there was still fire. Anger meant she was fighting him, but there was no fire in Nora's eyes. They were completely, utterly dead, hollowed out, stripped of the warmth, the quiet defiance, the gentle grace that had drawn him to her. She looked at him, not as a monster to be feared, but as something grotesque, something pathetic, something that belonged under a shoe. In that single, agonizing look, Roman realized exactly what Maria had meant. Beatrice hadn't touched a single hair on Nora's head. She hadn't bruised her skin or broken her bones. She had done something infinitely worse. She had taken a scalpel to the false reality Roman had built, cut away the romantic illusion, and forced Nora to look at the rotting meat underneath. She had destroyed the woman Roman loved by introducing her to the man he actually was, The grandfather clock in the corner of the library ticked. Tick, tick, tick. The sound seemed to sync with the hammering pulse at the base of Roman's throat. Water dripped from the hem of his dark overcoat, pooling on the floor. He stood paralyzed. He, a man who commanded an army of killers, who shifted millions of dollars with a nod, who held the city's political infrastructure by the throat, was entirely immobilized by the quiet, dead stare of a civilian in a grey sweater. "Nora," Roman said. The word scraped out of his throat, raw and pathetic. He hated how it sounded. He sounded like a beggar. Nora's gaze flicked down to his hands. Roman instinctively pulled them back, but it was too late. He had forgotten to wash. Deep into the creases of his knuckles, under the beds of his fingernails, the dried, rust-brown blood of the man in the warehouse clung to him like a second skin. Nora's throat swallowed once. A tiny, imperceptible motion. Then, she looked back at his face. The disgust in her eyes wasn't explosive. It was a quiet, suffocating blanket. "You don't get to say her name," Beatrice remarked softly. She crushed the stub of her cigarette into the crystal ashtray, the embers hissing softly against the glass. "Not anymore. It's unseemly." "Get out," Roman growled, not looking away from Nora. "Beatrice, get out of this room before I forget that we have an arrangement." Beatrice let out a soft, elegant laugh. She stood up, smoothing the front of her silk blouse. She didn't look afraid. She looked deeply amused. "Oh, Roman, you always default to threats of violence when your intellect fails you. It's so terribly pedestrian." She walked around the table, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards where the rug ended. As she passed him, she paused, leaning in so close he could smell the gin on her breath. "You don't get to keep a pet bird and pretend you aren't the one who broke its wings," Beatrice whispered near his ear. "I didn't do this to hurt her, Roman. I did this because your hypocrisy was becoming embarrassing." She stepped back, giving him a cold, mocking smile, and walked out of the library. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sounding like the ceiling of a tomb. Roman and Nora were alone. The fire popped, sending a spray of orange sparks up the chimney. Roman took a hesitant step forward. "Nora, let me explain. The files, they lack the nuance of what actually happened. Thomas was reckless. He was going to get you killed. Don't." Her voice was barely above a whisper. It was rough, as if she hadn't used it in years. It stopped Roman dead in his tracks. Nora slowly pushed her chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floor. She stood up. Her legs were trembling slightly, but her posture was rigid. She looked down at the table, at the ledger that detailed the exact cost of a human life. Her brother's life. She didn't touch it. She looked at it like it was radioactive. "Nora, please." Roman tried again, stepping closer, reaching out a hand. As his hand extended, Nora flinched. It wasn't a subtle movement. Her entire body jerked backward, recoiling violently, as if he had swung a hot iron at her face. She pressed her back against the tall bookshelves, her breath hitching, her eyes locking onto his blood-stained hands. The physical rejection hit Roman like a physical blow to the sternum. His hand dropped to his side. The air rushed out of his lungs. "I thought," Nora started, her voice breaking. She closed her eyes, shaking her head. When she opened them again, the tears had finally come. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, agonizing regret. "I thought you were saving me. I sat at your table. I ate your food. I smiled at you." She brought a trembling hand up to her mouth, a gagging sound escaping her throat. She was physically revolted by the memory of her own compliance. "You were safe here," Roman argued, though the words felt hollow on his tongue. "You are safe here." "I am in a grave," Nora whispered. She pushed herself off the bookshelf. She didn't look at him anymore. She couldn't. She walked toward the door. "You can't leave," Roman said, desperation bleeding into his tone. He turned, stepping in front of the door, using his massive frame to block the exit. "You step outside these gates, you are unprotected. The rival families know who you are. They know you mean something to me." Nora stopped a few feet from him. She looked up. The hollow emptiness in her eyes had hardened into something cold and sharp, something that looked terrifyingly like Beatrice's stare. "I mean nothing to you," Nora said, her voice dropping into a flat, dead register. "I am a trophy you bought with my brother's blood to make yourself feel like a decent man. But you are not a decent man, Roman. You are a butcher. And I would rather take my chances with the wolves outside than spend another second in this slaughterhouse." She stepped forward, directly into his space. She was a foot shorter than him, 100 pounds lighter, completely unarmed. Yet Roman felt entirely overpowered. "Move," she commanded softly. Roman's jaw tightened. Every instinct he possessed, the instincts of a kingpin, a possessor, a man who took what he wanted and crushed what defied him, screamed at him to grab her arm, to lock the door, to force her to stay until she understood. But he looked at her pale face. He smelled the vanilla and dust beneath the sharp scent of Beatrice's cigarette smoke. He looked at his own hands, the blood dried and flaking into his lifelines. He realized then that Beatrice had won. The illusion was dead. If he touched Nora now, it wouldn't be as a protector. It would be as her warden. Slowly, agonizingly, Roman took a step to the side. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. She reached out, grabbed the brass handle of the library door, and pulled it open. The cold, drafty air of the hallway rushed in. Roman watched her walk out into the foyer, a small, grey ghost drifting through his sterile marble halls. He didn't follow her. He stood in the library, listening to the heavy front doors open and close, listening to the muffled sound of the rain rushing into the house for a brief second before being sealed out again. Roman looked down at the table, at the ledger, at his hands. He was alone. He was exactly what he was supposed to be, a monster in a very quiet house. The rain did not cleanse. It merely made the filth of the city slick and mobile. Nora walked until the high arches of her leather boots, a reluctant gift from Roman she had worn simply to avoid an argument, began to rub the skin off her heels. She didn't know how far she had gone from the iron gates of the Rossi estate. 2 miles, maybe 5. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the library and down the long, winding driveway had burned off, leaving behind a cold, metallic exhaustion that tasted like pennies at the back of her throat. Her oversized grey sweater, once a shield against the cavernous draughts of Roman's house, was now a heavy, sodden trap. It weighed 10 pounds, clinging to her shoulders, the cheap wool blend smelling faintly of wet dog and the vanilla soap she had used that morning. She stopped under the flickering neon overhang of a closed pawn shop. The red light hummed, casting a bruised, purple hue over the cracked sidewalk. Nora leaned against the damp brick wall, her chest heaving. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, waiting for the tears to return. They didn't. The emotional shock had bypassed sorrow and landed squarely in a profound, hollow nausea. Thomas was dead. Not a car accident. Not a tragic spin-out on the slick coastal blacktop as the police report had stated. He had been suffocated in a van. By Leo. Leo, who always tipped his hat to her when she passed him in the halls. Leo, who had carefully carried a box of fragile, first-edition poetry books up to her room just last week. And Roman, who sat across from her in the evenings, nursing a scotch, asking her quiet questions about the binding techniques of the 19th century. Roman, who had looked at her with eyes that she had stupidly, pathetically mistaken for loneliness. They weren't lonely. They were dead. The eyes of a butcher assessing the meat. A rusted sedan drove past, its tires hitting a pothole and spraying a fan of oily water onto Nora's shins. She didn't even flinch. The physical discomfort was a welcome distraction from the agonizing montage playing behind her eyes. Every time she had thanked him, every time she had smiled, every time she had felt a treasonous flush of warmth when he looked at her. She had been polishing the ego of her brother's executioner. She pushed off the brick wall. Standing still meant freezing, and freezing meant someone would eventually call the police. The police belonged to Roman. Half the precincts in the city operated on his payroll, quietly filing away complaints and losing evidence bags. If she ended up in a squad car, she would be back in the library before sunrise. She needed a place that didn't ask questions. She needed a place that existed in the cracks of the city's facade. 4 blocks later, the neon sign of a 24-hour diner cut through the sheets of rain. The Silver Spoon. The S and the P were burnt out. Nora pushed through the heavy glass door. A bell jingled, a weak, tinny sound. The air inside hit her like a physical wall, thick with the smell of scorched coffee, heavy fry grease, and floor bleach. The diner was nearly empty. A truck driver snored softly in a corner booth, his face pressed against a crumpled napkin. An elderly woman sat at the counter, staring vacantly at a piece of cherry pie. Nora walked toward the back, her boots squeaking embarrassingly loud on the black and white checkered linoleum. She slid into a vinyl booth. The dark green material was slashed in the center, patched with silver duct tape that caught the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light overhead. A waitress approached. She looked 50, but was probably 35, with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda pinned askew on a yellow uniform. She held a coffee pot with a chipped rim. "You look like you tried to swim across the turnpike, honey," Brenda said, her voice a raspy smoker's drawl. She flipped a thick ceramic mug right side up and filled it without asking. The dark liquid steamed, smelling like burnt earth. "I left my wallet at home," Nora said. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, hating the fragility in the sound. "I'm sorry. I can't pay for that." Brenda paused, the coffee pot hovering. She looked at Nora's soaked clothes, the bruised circles under her eyes, the complete lack of a purse or phone. Brenda set the pot down and reached into her apron, pulling out a crumpled dollar bill, tossing it onto the table. "On me," Brenda said. "Drink it before you catch pneumonia, and don't drip on the seats." Nora wrapped both hands around the thick ceramic. The heat burned her palms, but she held on, desperate for the sensation. It grounded her. It was real. Unlike the imported tea in fine bone china, this cheap, bitter coffee was honest. She took a sip. It scalded her tongue. She was free. She was broke, freezing, and hunted. But she was free. For the first time in 6 months, nobody was guarding her door. But as the warmth seeped into her fingers, the silence of the diner was shattered by the heavy, synchronized thud of boots hitting the linoleum. The glass door swung shut, the tinny bell jingling frantically. Nora didn't look up immediately, but she felt the shift in the room's air pressure. The truck driver in the corner stopped snoring, shifted his weight, and suddenly, quietly, slid out of his booth and headed for the bathroom. Brenda, who had been wiping down the counter, went perfectly still, her rag pausing over a coffee stain. Nora slowly lifted her eyes over the rim of the mug. 2 men stood by the entrance, shaking the rain from their dark jackets. They weren't cops. Cops had a distinct posture, a bureaucratic heaviness. These men moved with a predatory, loose-limbed arrogance. One of them, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, scanned the room. His eyes passed over the old woman at the counter, dismissed the empty tables, and locked onto the back booth. On to Nora. He nudged his companion. He smiled. Nora's blood ran cold. The man didn't belong to Roman. She had spent 6 months memorizing the faces of the Rossi syndicate. She knew the guards, the drivers, the collectors. These men were strangers, and in this city, a stranger who smiled at Roman Rossi's collateral was worse than any monster she had left behind. Back in the sprawling estate, the library was perfectly, horribly still. Roman stood exactly where Nora had left him. The heavy oak doors remained shut. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, bruised shadows across the Persian rug. The ledger, Thomas's death warrant in black ink, sat open on the mahogany table. Roman moved finally, a slow, mechanical rotation of his shoulders. He walked to the table and closed the folder. The slap of the heavy manila paper was deafening. He didn't scream. He didn't smash the antique lamps or hurl his crystal Scotch glass into the fireplace. His rage was not the explosive, theatrical kind. It was a cold, dense mass sinking into his bones, freezing his joints. He walked out of the library, leaving the lights off. The foyer was empty. Maria was gone, likely barricaded in her quarters with her rosary, praying for dawn. Roman bypassed the grand staircase and headed down the narrow hall toward his private study. Attached to it was a small half-bathroom. He pushed the door open, ignoring the light switch, relying on the ambient glow from the street lamps bleeding through the frosted window. He turned on the faucet. The water sputtered, then rushed out in a harsh, cold stream. Roman shoved his hands under the water. The dried, rust-colored blood on his knuckles flaked and dissolved. He pumped liquid soap into his palms, the sharp scent of synthetic pine cutting through the smell of his wet wool coat. He scrubbed. He dug his nails into his own skin, tearing at the cuticles, scraping the pads of his fingers until they were raw and pink. The water swirling down the porcelain drain turned a pale, watery red. "I am in a grave," Nora's voice echoed against the bathroom tiles. He had known this day would come. A man could not build a sanctuary on top of a mass grave and expect the floorboards not to rot. But he had arrogantly believed he could manage the decay. He thought he could keep the stench out of the East Wing. He thought if he spoke softly enough, if he brought her rare books and asked about her day, it would magically rewrite the brutal arithmetic of who he was. He turned the water off. He didn't use a towel. He let his raw, dripping hands hang at his sides. He walked into his study and picked up his desk phone. He dialed a sequence of numbers from memory. It rang twice. "Yeah, boss." Leo's voice was gravelly, backed by the low thrum of a car engine. "Where is she?" Roman asked. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. It was the voice that ordered graves dug, a brief, heavy pause on the line. Leo knew exactly who she was. "She's heading south on 4th Avenue. Walking, no coat, just hit the industrial district." "Keep a 6-block radius," Roman instructed, staring blankly at the wall. "Do not let her see you. Do not intercept." "Boss, she's freezing. It's pouring out here. She's heading into Dominic Russo's territory. The East Side docks aren't safe for a stray dog right now, let alone your—" Leo stopped, swallowing the end of the sentence. "She is not mine," Roman said. The words tasted like ash. "But she is our responsibility. If one of Russo's men so much as looks at her shadow, you break their legs. But you do not touch her. She needs to walk." "Understood." Roman hung up. He walked to the heavy oak desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a bottle of Lagavulin and a single glass. He poured 3 fingers, the amber liquid splashing against the crystal. He drank it in one swallow. It burned a hot, agonizing trail down his throat, a small, punishing comfort. Footsteps clipped sharply against the hard wood of the hallway. Beatrice appeared in the doorway. She had changed into a silk robe, midnight blue, cinched tightly at her narrow waist. She held a fresh glass of gin, the ice clinking cheerfully. She leaned against the doorframe, observing him with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching an insect struggle in a jar. "You look terrible, Roman," she noted smoothly. "You're dripping on the floorboards again." Roman poured another glass of scotch. He didn't look at her. "I could cut your access to the accounts tonight. I could exile you to the villa in Sicily and ensure you never see the inside of a social club in this city again." Beatrice laughed, a genuine melodic sound that chilled him. She walked into the room, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and alcohol. "You could, but you won't. Because if you send me away, you have to explain why. And the board members of the syndicate don't care about a heartbroken little bookworm. They care about stability. I provide stability. We are a unified front, Roman. A very expensive, very powerful brand." She stepped closer, resting a perfectly manicured hand on his desk. "I did you a favor. She was making you soft. Soft men make mistakes. And when you make mistakes, my stock portfolio suffers." Roman finally looked at her. His eyes were dead. "You didn't do it for the syndicate, Beatrice. You did it because you are hollow, and the sight of anything whole disgusts you." Beatrice's smile didn't falter, but it grew a fraction more brittle. "Perhaps. But I am honest about what I am. You were trying to play house with a hostage. It was embarrassing." She took a sip of her gin. "Let her run, Roman. She'll figure out soon enough that the monsters out there don't buy you expensive sweaters before they eat you." She turned and walked out, her silk robe trailing silently behind her. Roman stared at the empty doorway. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 1 a.m. Beatrice was right about one thing. The men outside didn't pretend. Roman's phone vibrated on the desk. It wasn't a call. It was a text from Leo. She stopped. "Silver Spoon Diner on 9th and Elm. We have a problem. 2 of Russo's collectors just walked in." They made her. Roman didn't reply. He dropped the heavy crystal glass onto the desk. The scotch spilled, soaking into a pile of import manifests. He grabbed his keys from the tray, the metal jingling sharply in the quiet room. He checked the holster at the small of his back, feeling the cold, reassuring steel of his Glock. He didn't run to save her. He didn't have the right to play the savior anymore. He went because he was a monster, and it was time to clear his territory. The air in the diner turned to lead. Nora didn't move. She kept her hands wrapped tightly around the chipped ceramic mug, staring into the black coffee. Her peripheral vision was hyper-focused, tracking the 2 men as they bypassed the counter, bypassed the empty middle section, and walked straight toward the back. Their boots squeaked on the wet linoleum. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It sounded like an animal dying. The man with the scar slid into the booth directly across from Nora. He didn't ask. He just dropped his weight onto the taped vinyl, forcing the table to shift and push hard against Nora's stomach. The second man, larger, thick-necked, and entirely silent, stood at the edge of the booth, blocking her only exit into the aisle. The scarred man smelled of stale beer, wet leather, and cheap, sharp peppermint. "Well, well," he said. His voice was a low, grating rasp. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He looked at her wet hair, her shivering shoulders, the complete absence of jewelry or a coat. You're off the leash, ain't you? Nora swallowed hard. The metallic taste in her mouth flared. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just drinking coffee. The man grinned, revealing a chipped front tooth. Nah, you're Rossi's little pet bird. Saw you through the tinted windows of his car a couple of months back outside the library. Boss Dominic recognized you from the files. Said you were the collateral for the dead brother. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers tapping the rim of her coffee mug. Nora instinctively pulled her hands back, tucking them into her lap. Looks like Rossi threw you out in the trash, the man continued, his eyes dropping to her shivering hands. Or you ran away. Either way, you're sitting in Russo territory now. Unchaperoned. That's bad manners. Leave me alone, Nora said. Her voice trembled, a pathetic betrayal of the defiant anger she wanted to project. She looked toward the counter. Brenda was gone. The kitchen door was swinging shut. The elderly woman had quietly slipped out the front. The diner was completely abandoned, save for her and the wolves. We ain't going to hurt you, sweetheart, the standing man grunted, speaking for the first time. He reached into his jacket. Boss Dominic just wants to have a chat. Figure out what kind of codes Rossi punches into his safe. You're coming with us. I don't know anything, Nora said, pressing her back against the wall of the booth. He never told me anything. Dominic has ways of jogging memories, the scarred man said, sliding out of the booth and standing up. He reached down, grabbing Nora by the bicep. His grip was entirely different from Roman's. Roman's touch, however tainted by lies, had been careful. This man's fingers dug into her muscle like iron hooks, bruising her instantly through the thick wool of her sweater. He hauled her to her feet. Nora stumbled, her blistered heels crying out in pain as she hit the linoleum. Walk, the heavy man ordered, stepping aside to let his partner drag her down the aisle. Nora planted her boots. She threw her weight backward, twisting her arm. Let go of me, she screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet diner, vibrating off the greasy windows. The scarred man yanked her forward violently, her shoulder popping agonizingly. Shut up, bitch, or I'll drag you by your hair. He took one step toward the front door. The glass door of the diner didn't open. It shattered. It exploded inward in a shower of brilliant, deadly diamonds. The tinny bell ripped off its hinge, clattering across the floor. The two Russo men froze, whirling toward the entrance, their hands diving for the weapons inside their jackets. Roman stepped through the empty, jagged doorframe. He didn't look like the man in the tailored suits who sipped scotch by the fire. He didn't look like the quiet, restrained intellectual who debated literature. He looked like the butcher of the Rossi syndicate. His dark coat was soaking wet, hanging heavy on his broad shoulders. Water dripped from his dark hair into his eyes, but he didn't blink. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness. There was no anger in his expression, just a void. He didn't draw the gun at his back. He didn't say a word. He simply walked forward. The scarred man released Nora's arm, shoving her into the heavy man behind him, and pulled a snub-nosed revolver from his waistband. Rossi, you crazy son of a... He didn't finish the sentence. Roman closed the distance with terrifying, unnatural speed. He didn't aim a punch. He grabbed the heavy, thick glass sugar dispenser from the nearest table and swung it in a brutal, horizontal arc. The thick glass connected with the side of the scarred man's face. The sickening crack of bone giving way echoed louder than the shattering glass. The man went down instantly, his legs folding beneath him, dropping like a marionette with its strings cut. He hit the linoleum hard, blood instantly pooling around his head, mixing with the spilled sugar crystals. The heavy man yelled, shoving Nora hard against the counter. He raised his own weapon, aiming at Roman's chest. Roman didn't duck. He stepped into the heavy man's space. He caught the man's wrist with his left hand, twisting it upward with a sharp, violent wrench. The gun fired into the ceiling, blowing a hole through the fluorescent light casing. Sparks rained down, plunging half the diner into shadows. Before the man could recover, Roman drove his right fist into the man's throat. A sickening, wet crunch followed. The man dropped the gun, clutching his neck with both hands, his eyes bulging as he desperately gasped for air that couldn't get past his crushed windpipe. He stumbled backward, knocking over a stool, and collapsed onto the floor, his boots thrashing weakly against the checkered tiles. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing with the echo of the gunshot and the frantic, gurgling breaths of the man on the floor. The air suddenly smelled of ozone, cordite, and copper. Roman stood in the center of the aisle. His knuckles were bleeding again, the fresh red washing away the pale, scrubbed skin. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath his wet shirt. He slowly turned his head to look at Nora. Nora was pressed flat against the diner counter, her hands gripping the formica edge so hard her knuckles were white. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. She looked at the bloody sugar dispenser, the man bleeding out on the floor, and then, slowly, she raised her eyes to Roman. He waited for the relief. He waited for her to run to him, to thank him for saving her from the wolves. But Nora's eyes held no relief. They held sheer, unfiltered terror. She looked at Roman exactly the same way she had looked at the men who had just tried to abduct her. The violence hadn't saved her. It had only proved Beatrice right. He wasn't a knight. He was just the biggest predator in the room, effortlessly brutal, completely desensitized to the slaughter. Roman felt the last, pathetic thread of his illusion snap. He didn't step toward her. He didn't offer his hand. He looked down at the blood on his knuckles, then back at the terrified woman he had broken. "Leo is in the alley out back," Roman said. His voice was rough, completely dead. He didn't try to soften it. "He has a car, he has cash, a clean phone, and a train ticket to Boston. He will not follow you past the station." "Go." Nora stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the door, then at the bodies, then at the back exit, swinging gently on its hinges near the kitchen. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say goodbye. She pushed herself off the counter, gave Roman a wide, terrified berth, and ran toward the back door, disappearing into the dark kitchen without looking back. Roman stood alone among the wreckage, the rain blowing in through the shattered front door, washing the blood across the linoleum floor. He watched the pink water swirl around his boots. He had let the bird out of the cage. But he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who dealt in death, that the sky was full of hawks, and he had just painted a target on her back. The alley behind the diner smelled of rotting lettuce, wet cardboard, and the sharp, chemical tang of dumpster runoff. Nora burst through the heavy metal kitchen door, her boots slipping on the grease-coated concrete. She hit the brick wall of the adjacent building, her breath tearing out of her lungs in ragged, burning gasps. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near a stack of wooden pallets. Nora flinched, raising her arms over her head in a pathetic, instinctive crouch. "Hey, it's me." The voice was gravelly, quiet. "Leo." He stepped under the weak, yellow glow of a security light. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His shoulders were hunched against the freezing rain, and he held a thick, brown manila envelope in one hand. The other hand rested casually near his belt, far away from his weapon, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. Nora stared at him. This was the man who had suffocated her brother. He looked entirely ordinary, a tired man with a receding hairline and a slight limp in his left leg. The banality of him made her stomach heave. She leaned over the wet concrete and threw up exactly nothing, dry heaving until her ribs ached. Leo didn't step closer. He didn't offer a platitude. He just waited. When Nora finally wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, Leo tossed the envelope onto the hood of a rusted sedan parked in the alley. It landed with a heavy, wet slap. "There's 10,000 in unmarked bills in there," Leo said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A burner phone, a new ID, and a sleeper car ticket on the 2:15 a.m. Amtrak to Boston. The train leaves in 40 minutes from Union Station. There's a cab idling at the end of the block. He's paid to take you there." Nora looked at the envelope. It was soaked through on the edges, the paper turning dark brown. "Why?" she croaked. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. "Why didn't he let them take me?" "Because he's the boss," Leo said simply. "And because you don't belong in the meat grinder." "You put my brother in the meat grinder," Nora shot back, her voice suddenly finding a brittle, desperate edge. Leo looked away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He lit one, the brief flare of the lighter illuminating the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes. "Your brother jumped in head first, kid. He stole from the accounts. He sold syndicate routes to Dominic Russo. He signed his own warrant. The boss. Roman tried to buy the debt out. He tried to cover it. But the board found out. When the board finds out, you die. That's the math." Leo exhaled a plume of grey smoke into the rain. "Roman took the hit himself to keep Russo from doing it slower. Then he took you in. It was a stupid, soft move. And in our world, soft moves get people killed." He gestured with his cigarette toward the end of the alley. "Take the envelope. Get in the cab. Don't look back. If you stay in this city, Russo will use you to bleed Roman dry. And Roman will burn the city down to get you back. You'll kill thousands of people just by standing here." Nora didn't argue. There was no argument to be had. She walked to the sedan, her boots squelching, and picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy with the weight of dirty money. She shoved it under her damp sweater, pressing it against her freezing stomach, and walked toward the street. The cab ride was a blur of smeared neon and rhythmic windshield wipers. The heater in the back seat was broken, blasting cold air onto her soaked ankles. Nora shivered uncontrollably, staring out the window at the city that had swallowed her family whole. Union Station was cavernous and empty, echoing with the sound of a lone floor scrubber. Nora walked to the Amtrak terminal. She pulled the ticket from the envelope. Destination: Boston, Massachusetts. She stared at the printed letters. The ink was slightly smudged from the rain. Boston. Roman had chosen it. Roman had paid for it, which meant Roman knew exactly where she would be. Nora paused in the middle of the concourse. A cold, sharp realization pierced through her exhaustion. If Roman knew, then Beatrice could find out. Beatrice had the ledger. Beatrice had the access. And if Beatrice knew, Dominic Russo could know. The two men at the diner hadn't found her by accident. A woman walking in the rain at 1 a.m. didn't randomly stumble into syndicate collectors. She had been led there. She was a pawn on a board she couldn't even see. Boston wasn't a sanctuary. It was just a different cage, and the wolves had the address. Nora turned away from the Amtrak terminal. She walked across the station, her blistered feet bleeding freely into her expensive leather boots, heading toward the Greyhound bus terminal. The lights there were harsher, the floors grimmier. A line of exhausted, hollow-eyed people waited near a bay door. She walked up to the plexiglass window. An attendant chewed gum, barely looking up from a magazine. "When is the next bus leaving?" Nora asked. "I don't care where it's going, just the furthest one leaving right now." The attendant tapped a few keys. "Cleveland. Leaves in 5 minutes." "I'll take it," Nora said. She pulled a $100 bill from the thick stack in her sweater and pushed it under the slot. 10 minutes later, Nora was sitting in the back row of a bus, smelling heavily of diesel fumes and stale urine. The engine rumbled beneath her seat, vibrating through her spine. She looked out the tinted, streaked window as the bus pulled out of the terminal, leaving the city skyline behind. She took the Amtrak ticket to Boston and carefully, methodically, tore it into tiny white squares. She dropped the pieces into the empty soda cup left in the cup holder beside her. She was dead to the city. She was dead to her brother, and she had to be dead to Roman Rossi. The library smelled distinctly of bleach, though no one had cleaned it. It was the psychological residue of the slaughter Roman had just walked away from. He pushed the heavy oak doors open. The fire had completely died, leaving a mound of grey, powdery ash in the hearth. Beatrice was sitting exactly where she had been hours ago, though she had moved on from gin to a neat glass of vodka. She didn't look up from the financial quarterly report resting on her lap. "I heard the police scanner," Beatrice remarked, turning a page. The paper rasped loudly in the dead room. "A disturbance at a diner on 9th. 2 fatalities. Dominic Russo's men. You've been busy, Roman." Roman stood in the doorway. His dark coat was gone, discarded in the foyer. His knuckles were wrapped in stark white medical gauze, tightly bound by his own hands. Blood had already begun to seep through the fabric on his right hand, a tiny, blooming red rose. He didn't yell. The screaming rage had burned out on the linoleum floor of the diner, leaving only a cold, mechanical clarity. "How did Russo know she was there, Beatrice?" Roman asked. His voice was a flat, deadline hum. Beatrice sighed, setting the quarterly report on the mahogany table. She finally looked up, her expression a mask of elegant boredom. "Does it matter?" "She's gone. The liability has been removed." "A civilian walking in the industrial district at 1 in the morning, Roman continued, stepping slowly into the room. "No phone, no tracker, in the pouring rain, and 2 of Russo's top collectors just happened to stop at an abandoned diner for a cup of coffee at the exact same moment." He stopped opposite her, leaning his knuckles against the edge of the table. The pressure sent spikes of agony up his forearms, but he welcomed it. It anchored him. "You called him." Beatrice took a slow sip of her vodka. The ice clinked against her teeth. "I simply made a discreet inquiry regarding a missing asset. Russo's men patrol that area. I assumed they would secure her and hold her for ransom. It would have given us the political leverage to seize the East Side docks we've been negotiating for. A hostage exchange. Business, Roman. You used her as bait to start a war. I used her to correct your oversight," Beatrice snapped, the boredom finally cracking, revealing the sharp, venomous ambition underneath. She stood up, her silk robe rustling. "You were compromised. You were playing at being a tragic hero while the board whispered about your lack of focus. I gave Russo a target. If he took her, he broke the treaty. We wipe him out, take his territory, and you look like a conqueror. If he killed her..." She shrugged, a microscopic, chilling movement of her shoulders. Then the distraction is buried, and we move on. Roman stared at the woman he had married. He saw the cold, brilliant architecture of her mind. She was perfectly suited for this world. She was the monster he pretended not to be. "You didn't factor in that I would kill them," Roman said softly. "You're impulsive when you're emotional," Beatrice sneered. "It's your worst trait." "No," Roman said, straightening up. He looked down at his blood-spotted bandages. "My worst trait was thinking I could keep a clean room in a slaughterhouse. I thought if I kept my hands out of the dirt, I could sit at the table with her." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He placed it on the mahogany table between them. "What are you doing?" Beatrice asked, her eyes narrowing. "I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom," Roman said, Beatrice blinked, her composure faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me?" "You wanted the board. You wanted the East Side docks. You wanted the war," Roman stated, his tone devoid of any theatricality. It was a simple recitation of facts. "You have it. I just executed 2 of Russo's lieutenants without provocation. The treaty is broken. Dominic will retaliate by morning. The streets are going to run red, Beatrice." He turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Beatrice's voice pitched up, a sudden sharp edge of genuine alarm cutting through her arrogance. "You can't just walk away. The syndicate needs a wartime boss. You are the muscle." Roman stopped with his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back over his shoulder. The library was dark, the shadows clinging to the heavy oak shelves, wrapping around Beatrice's pristine, silk-clad figure. "I am the butcher," Roman corrected her softly. "And I have work to do outside the walls. You manage the accounts, Beatrice. You manage the board. Because for the next 6 months, I am going to dismantle Dominic Russo's entire organization, piece by piece. Not for the docks, not for the territory." "Then for what?" she hissed. "So that he never has the resources to look for a girl on a train to Boston," Roman said. He opened the door and walked out. He didn't look back as Beatrice finally dropped her glass, the crystal shattering against the floorboards, the sound sharp and entirely useless. Roman walked down the quiet marble hallway of his estate for the last time. He stripped off his expensive watch and dropped it onto a side table. He didn't belong in palaces. He belonged in the dark, tearing the throats out of the wolves so the one decent thing in his life could keep walking. 8 months later, Cleveland was bitterly cold in February. The wind whipped off Lake Erie, carrying a damp, biting frost that settled deep into the concrete and refused to leave. Nora stood behind the counter of Golden Cleaners, a small, dingy dry-cleaning shop tucked between a pawnbroker and a failing liquor store. The air inside was thick and suffocating, smelling of perchloroethylene, hot steam, and scorched cotton. It was a smell that dug into the pores and ruined appetites. But Nora didn't mind. It smelled like anonymity. She pulled a heavy wool peacoat from the pressing machine, the steam hissing violently as she released the pedal. Her hands were raw, the cuticles cracked from the chemicals, her nails cut brutally short. She wore a faded flannel shirt and dark jeans. The oversized grey cable-knit sweater from the Rossi estate had been thrown into a dumpster at a rest stop in Pennsylvania. She hung the coat on the moving rack and hit the mechanical button. The rack churned, a screeching metallic groan that drowned out the sound of the wind rattling the front windows. She was safe. Her new ID said her name was Claire. She paid rent in cash. She didn't own a phone. She walked a different route to her studio apartment every night. The paranoia was exhausting, a constant, low-level hum at the base of her skull. But it kept her alive. She had scoured the library computers for weeks after arriving. The news from her old city had been brief but bloody. A gangland war had erupted. Dominic Russo's empire had collapsed in a spectacular wave of violence. Buildings burned. Bodies were found in the harbor. And then, abruptly, the violence had stopped. The Rossi syndicate had absorbed the ruins. Roman's name was never mentioned in the papers. He was a ghost in the machine. The bell above the dry cleaner's door jingled. Nora's spine stiffened instinctively. She reached under the counter, her fingers brushing the heavy iron pipe she kept near the register. She forced her face into a blank, retail mask and looked up. It was just an old man, shivering, holding a plastic bag containing a stained suit. Nora exhaled slowly, her heart rate decelerating from a frantic sprint to a heavy thud. She took his ticket, smiled weakly, and handed him his receipt. At 7 p.m., she flipped the sign to closed. She locked the deadbolt, pulled down the metal grate, and stepped out into the freezing night. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the salt-stained pavement. She began her walk home. The cold cut through her flannel shirt immediately, biting at her collarbones. She kept her head down, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. As she turned the corner onto her street, she froze. Parked across from her dilapidated apartment building was a black Lincoln Town car. It wasn't the kind of car that belonged in this neighborhood. It was immaculate, the paint gleaming like wet obsidian under the sodium lights. The engine was running, a low, powerful purr that vibrated through the freezing air. The windows were heavily tinted. Nora's breath hitched in her throat. The iron pipe was miles away. She was in the open. Her first instinct was to run, to turn around, head back to the bus station, and disappear to another city. But her blistered feet felt bolted to the concrete. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He wore a heavy, dark overcoat. He was broad-shouldered, moving with a terrifying, loose-limbed grace. Nora took a step backward, her pulse roaring in her ears. The man didn't cross the street. He didn't look at her. He simply walked to the trunk of the car, opened it, and pulled out a large, heavy duffel bag. He dropped the bag onto the snowy sidewalk. Then he turned slightly. The streetlight caught his profile. It wasn't Roman. It was Leo. He looked older, grayer. A fresh, jagged scar tracked down the side of his jaw. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He merely gave a sharp, definitive nod, acknowledging her presence without breaching the distance. He got back into the Lincoln, the heavy door shutting with a solid, expensive thud. The car pulled away, the tires crunching over the dirty snow, its taillights bleeding red into the darkness before disappearing around the block. Nora stood alone on the corner. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face. Slowly, cautiously, she crossed the street. She stopped in front of the heavy canvas duffel bag. It wasn't ticking. It wasn't leaking. She knelt in the slush and unzipped the top. Inside was a heavy, incredibly warm down winter coat. Beneath it lay a stack of thick, thermal blankets, and tucked into the fold of the coat was a small, sealed plastic bag containing $5,000 in small, untraceable bills. There was no note. There was no demand. But as Nora pulled the heavy winter coat from the bag to inspect it, a piece of paper fluttered out of the pocket and landed in the snow. She picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a page torn from a book, specifically a 19th century poetry anthology she had been restoring the day she ran. The edges were perfectly preserved, and clinging to the fabric of the coat, faint but unmistakable against the smell of the city exhaust and snow, was the scent of expensive bergamot tea, old paper, and a lingering trace of ozone. Roman. He hadn't come. He would never come. He knew the sight of him would break her. He knew his hands were permanently stained, that his world was toxic. He had butchered a rival empire to ensure no one would ever look for her. And now, he was content to be the ghost in the dark. He wasn't playing the savior anymore. He was just ensuring the survivor stayed warm. Nora held the page in her hand. A tear, hot and stinging, broke loose, tracking down her frozen cheek. It wasn't a tear of romantic longing. It was a complex, heavy grief for the monster who loved her enough to stay 1,000 miles away. She slipped the heavy coat over her shoulders. It wrapped around her, dense and impenetrable against the freezing wind. She picked up the bag, turned, and walked into her building, locking the heavy deadbolt behind her, finally safe in the quiet, empty dark. Roman Rossi proved that the ultimate act of love from a monster isn't a rescue. It's an exile. He destroyed an empire to keep Nora safe, accepting his role as the villain in her story, so she could finally be the author of her own. Some debts are paid in blood, but the heaviest are paid in silence and distance. Did Roman make the right choice? Or is Nora still just a bird in a much larger, colder cage? If this dark, grounded finale left you breathless, hit the like button, share with your fellow drama addicts, and subscribe for more raw storytelling.